That is the thing about Jesuits, is the breadth of the specializations that Jesuits have. Again, it's part of our calling to be ready to go to what's most important.
You can't tell the history of Canada without telling the history of the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. Infused with the spirituality of St. Ignatius and eyes towards the frontier, the Jesuits moved into English Canada over the last 2 centuries. Now, Father Jacques Monet, the eminent Jesuit historian, has edited a new series that charts the historic course. Conscience of a Nation, the 3rd and final volume of the Jesuit History series, today on Subject Matters. Jacques Monet, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's wonderful to have you.
It's wonderful to be here, actually, and with all these books around.
Well, first of all, congratulations on this series of books, the Jesuit History series. It's quite remarkable. And my first question for you is, why compile this history of the Jesuits in English Canada, and why now?
I think why now is that the authors, each chapter is by a different Jesuit, are all still around, and some of them for a longer time than me, but are still around and that can actually tell the story since the beginning. Some of them go back far enough that most of the story of the English-speaking Jesuits in Canada can be told by people who were close to being there.
And I know for the Jesuits it's very important to keep a well-documented history as much as possible.
That's right. I don't know why, but Jesuits seem to, yes. And I'm a historian, so I'm not about to say that's wrong.
And even so much of the history that we have of Canada, dating back even before the time that this series looks at, which begins in 1842.
That's 1842, when the Jesuits were asked to come back to Canada, namely to Montreal, by the Bishop of Montreal.
And then it was in 1842 when the Jesuits actually started to push west toward the rest of Canada.
Well, came to Montreal, and or went to Montreal, and then after that it was towards southern Ontario, yes, Toronto, and then Guelph, around that area of later Winnipeg, eventually Vancouver. Eventually there were Jesuit high schools or colleges from Newfoundland to Vancouver.
And when I read the book, something that comes out in all of the chapters is the foundation of the Jesuits, which is the spiritual exercises. How you interpret and use the spiritual exercises in your particular historical context is always a question that the Jesuit communities are asking. And one of the really interesting developments in the history of the Jesuits were the retreat ministry, the retreat house ministry.
Yes.
Where not only Jesuits, but even other Canadians, lay people, other religious communities were interested in starting to reflect with the exercises and use them in their life. Talk to me a little bit about that development.
Well, the ministry of the spiritual exercises starts with St. Ignatius, of course, who founded the spiritual exercises, and every Jesuit is brought up on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Historically, in Canada, in the 19th century, it went from preaching the exercises to closed or open retreats where the person would go and spend a few days or a whole month. If you do the whole exercises, normally it would last a month or 5 weeks of retiring from daily life and meditating on how the life of Christ and the principles of the Christian Church and the Catholic Church can be lived. The first retreat house of the English-speaking Canadian Jesuits was in New Brunswick. And then we were invited to begin a university which in Prince Edward Island, which didn't last long, but still that was the beginning in English for teaching, and then opening high schools and colleges across Canada.
We were talking about St. Ignatius and the exercises, and another thing that Ignatius talks a lot about is formation. The formation of the novices, the young guys.
Well,
that first
preparing Jesuits.
For preparing Jesuits,
the Jesuits are known to have a very long formation and to be in probation, so to speak, for as much as 14, 15. At its peak, it was 17 years between entering and then having final vows.
Right.
And that is to say, applying in one's life and in one's studies and profession and so forth, the insights of the spiritual exercises on the life of Christ and on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is the basis of the Christian faith. You know.
Now, the formation of the Jesuits in English Canada has progressed through, you know, the different decades, and one of the key figures that comes out in the book is Father John English. He was a real spiritual leader for the society, for the province, the English province.
Very much.
And was very influential in terms of rethinking about the novitiate, how the Jesuits do formation. But what was his contribution spiritually when you?
Well, most specifically, one of the main aspects of the spiritual exercises is to help people make right decisions. And John, we were novices together, John English and I, and he was a good friend. John's insight that he worked on and persuaded other people was right, was the practice of communal discernment, not just individual, how am I going to run my life based on these principles, but if I'm working in a group, if I'm in a college teaching, if I'm in a factory working, if I'm whatever one's context is, to make group discernment. How will each person in that group's insight into how the Christian principles can be applied here. So John reflected a lot on that and started publishing on that. One of the marvelous things about it is that the notion, or his teaching, his understanding, attracted a lot of people and spread, but also attracted a lot of people to Guelph, where the Jesuit novitiate and spiritual center eventually grew up. The novitiate was there, but eventually the spiritual center prospered mainly by John English's attraction.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll look at ecology, how the Jesuits have incorporated care for our common home into their ministry. And later in the show, another Jesuit who contributed to this book will be here to give his thoughts on the global reach of the Society of Jesus in Canada. So don't go anywhere. Father Jacques Monet serves as the director of the Canadian Institute of Jesuit Studies. A longtime educator and scholar, Jacques is regarded as one of Canada's leading historians by both secular and religious leaders. He's the executive editor of the Jesuit History series, a 3-volume collection on the Jesuits in English Canada from 1842 to 2016. When the Jesuits purchased their Guelph property in 1913, they could never have imagined how their values associated with the land would change over the ensuing decades. They would have had little comprehension of the ways in which the land would become central to the vitality of their apostolic and communal mission. With time, however, an integrated communal thinking developed that included an ever wider expansion of action and contemplation. The land would become a place where the human, the cultural, the ecological, and the spiritual would seek a common coexistence. We're back with Jacques Monet, a Jesuit historian, discussing the book that you edited, Conscience of a Nation, A History of Jesuits in English Canada. And one of the things we have to talk about, Jacques, is Jesuit education. And in one of the chapters, it was back in 1956, Archbishop Patrick Skinner of St. John's, Newfoundland, requested that the Jesuits open a school there. And one of the things that jumped out at me was, he said, you know, we're really concerned about the quality of education. This is what we need the Jesuits here for, to be involved in education. Now, without sounding too elitist or patting yourselves on the back, what is unique about the Jesuit approach to education that has put it in demand, or made it in demand for such a long period of time through the history of the Jesuits in North America?
Yes, since the 1500s.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the essential point about Jesuit education is that education is for the total person. It's not purely intellectual, but it is also moral and human relations, and the whole of life is, and the whole person is being educated. And that's why Jesuit schools have a lot of sports for physical development and so forth, and physical prowess, and as well as theater. Modern theater developed very much out of Jesuit education. It was promoted by graduates of Jesuit schools. Every Jesuit high school and or college puts on a play, at least one play every year.
Right.
And the students practice and so forth. It's great for memorizing and everything. But the idea is to develop the whole person.
Right.
Not just the intellectual, but also the social, the moral, and so forth. Yeah.
I think about the great example in the book, actually, of the story of Gonzaga, the school Gonzaga in St. John's, Newfoundland,
Yes.
and then post-referendum, when the
Yes.
province actually lost
Yes.
public funding for Catholic schools. And then there was a real groundswell of energy from, I mean, it was the Catholic population, the lay people, who said, look, we still want a Catholic
Yes,
education. They
yes.
came to the Jesuits, and the Jesuits said, yes, this is
Yes.
worthwhile, and built St. Bonaventure.
Well, that's very much part of the history of the society. The long formation, which is spiritual, but it's also intellectual and physical, and it's the whole person that's being educated. And so therefore there's a wider scope of Jesuit ministry. They're the only order that have a fourth vow, not only poverty, chastity, obedience, like all the others, but there's a fourth vow of special obedience to the Pope, to go to what the Pope thinks is most urgent in the Church at the time, which means, of course, to be prepared for quite a variety of ministries, whatever is most urgent. And so, so the whole person, and for whatever you might have to face that is most urgent in the Church at that time. So there's a wider scope, hence the very long formation of Jesuits.
And incorporating all these different, types of fields. I mean, from, farming, for example, in Guelph,
Yes,
to
yes.
really high, rigorous academic work. For example, of Bernard Lonergan,
Yes,
at
certainly,
Regis.
who some people consider to be the greatest Christian theologian since St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
And who was brought up in Montreal and Toronto intellectually, taught in Rome for a long time. Certainly he's one of the figures in the history of the English-speaking Canadian Jesuits who is absolutely noteworthy and world famous, world influence,
Right.
as John English with the spiritual exercises
Right.
and the discernment, the practice of communal discernment and so forth. Yeah.
Let's jump to this question of ecology, which is really interesting because it's kind of popular in the church today.
The chapter by John McCarthy
It's really wonderful.
in volume 3 is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
It really
yeah.
is. And you know what comes out, it's wonderful because it's the last chapter of the 3rd volume, which is the final volume of the series.
Yeah.
And as I was reading through the volume, I said to myself, the Jesuits are always on the frontier. And it really
And
struck
that's
me.
right it, yes. Now ecology
is the next frontier,
and,
right?
And in John McCarthy, the Jesuits have an expert.
Yeah.
And is right on, yeah.
What about what's going on in Guelph and the whole farming dimension, but the hands-on approach to these
Yes.
complex questions.
The farm at Guelph, where the English-speaking Jesuit novitiate was, that is, the first years of Jesuit training, was started because we needed food to feed the young Jesuits who were beginning, and the farm developed that way. It was to feed the scholastics.
Practical reason.
Very practical reasons, yes. And we weren't rich.
A notion that's very important to the Jesuits is justice, the concept of justice. And we know since the time of the Second Vatican Council that social justice has been a constitutive element of the gospel. It's been very clear in the Church's teachings. And the Jesuits have adopted that wholeheartedly, and now ecology has been thrown into this mix.
Right.
It's very important to you guys.
And from the time of the Council, the Vatican Council, and the later 60s and early 70s, certainly the notion that the Christian faith has as one of its constituent parts a social justice, that unjust structures are the enemy of the Christian message. And so people, well, like Mike Cherney and like Jim Webb and others in the English-speaking province worked on that and have contributed a lot on that. And of course, John McCarthy's article in volume 3 of our history seeks to bring in ecology, and successfully brings in ecology as part of the just constitutive of the Christian faith.
Right.
And that's a very interesting insight and a very, I'd say, a real contribution of John McCarthy's. And when you think of it, yes, that's what Jesuit works should be.
We have typically in our show, we have a guest reviewer, but we're going to do something a little bit differently today. We have one of the contributors of Volume 3 of this series, John Meehan, is here to talk a little bit about the chapter that he wrote on the international apostolate of the Canadian English province. John is the president of Campion College in Regina and also a professor of history. Here's Father John.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very grateful to have participated in this wonderful project, Volume 3 of the History of the Jesuits in English Canada. This is a very important work because as of next year, the English of that province will no longer exist, will be the Jesuits of Canada, English and French. My chapter is called A Global Mission, and it looks at the history of foreign missions of the English-Canadian Jesuits. I start with a quotation that says, "To be a Jesuit is to think globally." St. Ignatius of Loyola, when he set up the Jesuits as an international order, said that the world is our parish. And we can think of those great Jesuits of history, Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci, and others, who went to the four corners of the earth to bring Christ's gospel to everyone, to all peoples and all nations. The English Canadians began in Darjeeling in India in the 1940s, just as India was gaining its independence. They inherited some very prominent and prestigious schools from the Belgian Jesuits. But what happened over time was they began to minister to the people in the outlying areas, poor workers in the tea plantations. They set up ashrams for lepers that are now used for people living with HIV/AIDS. And there's even Gandhi Ashram. I tell the story of that school where the poorest of the poor sent their kids to learn music. And Gandhi Ashram now has an orchestra that tours the world. The second part of my chapter talks about Jesuit missions in the Kingdom of Bhutan. And there the Jesuits were allowed to set up schools, but not to proselytize. And I tell the story of a great Jesuit from Montreal, Bill Mackey, who taught the kids gymnastics, who gained the confidence of the royal family of Bhutan, and who was actually made their Minister of Education. So amazing story about Bill Mackey. And then I talk about the Jesuit missions in Zambia in the 1960s when African countries like Zambia were gaining their independence. And we had a small Jesuit group there under Paul Desmarais, Brother Paul Desmarais, who has set up an agricultural project that's based on sound ecology. And then finally, I talk about the more recent Jesuit activities in Jamaica, where we've witnessed Jesuit solidarity with the poor, and where one of our own, Father Martin Roykers, was tragically killed on the steps of his church in 2001. Killed most likely for standing up with the poor in a place where poor people continue to be exploited. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'd also like to thank Father Jacques Monet for really instilling all of his wisdom into these 3 volumes, and I think it's a great testament to Father Monet. Thank you and God bless.
Conscience of a Nation, Jesuits in English Canada, 1842 to 2016, is published by Novalis and is available for purchase at novalis.ca and at Ben McNally Books in Toronto. Conscience of a Nation is Volume 3 of the Jesuit History series. Volume 1, Teachers of a Nation, and Volume 2, Builders of a Nation, are also available from Novalis. To be a Jesuit is to think globally, to be concerned for the physical and the spiritual welfare of every man, woman, and child on earth, especially for those who are poor, powerless, or marginalized. A Jesuit province with no regular outreach beyond its own frontiers is unthinkable. Jacques, this is a series about Jesuits, by Jesuits mostly, so it's going to appeal obviously to the English province in Canada especially, but one of the questions I have for you is, why should a non-Jesuit, or would a non-Jesuit consider reading this history as well?
Well, for many, I imagine, it would be all those who have been students of Jesuits and have been friends and relatives of Jesuits.
Which is a huge percentage of the population,
well,
actually.
it is, depending on where and when, but overall, the Jesuits have been very prominent in higher education, well, high school and college education. And also in many, that is the thing about Jesuits, is the breadth of the specializations that Jesuits have. Again, it's part of our calling to be ready to go to what's most important and to have people who can contribute to solving or helping to promote or whatever is the most important question of our time. And Jesuits have done that. They've made many enemies in doing that. Eventually they were suppressed even by the Pope. But on the other hand, they've also contributed a lot with other people and so forth, finding the best at the time solutions to a lot of the problems of society.
Is there a part of the history of the Jesuits that that is your favorite, or that you really enjoy studying?
Well, I'm a Canadianist, so certainly the Jesuit history in Canada is one that has attracted me most and which I've taught most. And certainly the work of the Jesuits, again, as pioneers. The Jesuits started the first school, college, university in Canada in 1635. The Jesuit relations going back to the 1600s are part of the fundamental documents of Canadian history. And certainly the Jesuit, in that sense, presence in what has created what Canada is today is a critical one.
So what do you see, how do you see the Jesuits impacting or influencing the future of the challenges that come and Canada developing?
Well, you're talking to a historian and you're asking him to talk about the future. But I'm quite confident that there will always be Jesuits and that they will be brought up spiritually and intellectually and physically to be able to contribute, as Jesuits have, for the better thing, the greater glory of God, which is the Jesuit motto. And in fact, John McCarthy's article on ecology is a very good example of that. That is something that has come up recently, and here is a Jesuit who is actually contributing to our understanding of the importance, the moral importance of ecology.
Wherever there's a frontier, there you'll find the Jesuits.
Well, that's a very good motto. That's a very good overall statement. You're right. And we could name names and places, definitely.
Of course.
Yeah.
No, it's a remarkable history. Thank you very much for the work you did to compile it in this series. It really is an excellent summary, not only of the history of the Jesuits,
you know, yes,
but a really key element in the history of Canada as well. So, Jacques Monet, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
The book is Conscience of a Nation, Jesuits in English Canada, 1842 to 2016, which is volume 3 in the Jesuit History series. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in Toronto or online from Novalis. Just visit novalis.ca. Father Jacques Monet is a Jesuit priest and a renowned church and Canadian historian. He's the executive editor of the Jesuit History series. I want to thank Father John Meehan for his take on the International Apostolate of the Jesuits in English Canada. Father John is president of Campion College at the University of Regina and a professor of history. I should point out that Campion is celebrating their 100th anniversary, and they are Canada's only Jesuit liberal arts college, so congratulations to them. Their website is campioncollege.ca, and they're on Twitter @CampionUR. And if you'd like to learn more generally about the English-Canadian province of Jesuits, visit their website, jesuits.ca. And remember, if you want to see my video review of Conscience of a Nation, visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/subjectmatters, and click on the episode page with Jacques. And that's all the time we have for today, but thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Subject Matters with Sebastian Gomes is sponsored by the Cullum family. Our Salt and Light team works hard to bring you quality Catholic programming like Subject Matters. Please consider sponsoring our mission and making a donation today. Thank you for your generosity, and remember, our hope begins with you.